Welcome, everyone. My name is Olivia Brooks Allen, and I have the sincere pleasure of being part of Landmark Ventures, host of the Social Innovation Summit. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Social Innovation Summit, a very warm virtual welcome. And for those of you who might be getting to know us for the first time, welcome as well. The Social Innovation Summit is a platform designed to elevate groundbreaking ideas and innovative leaders who are changing the world for better. Throughout the year, we are honored to partner with trailblazing organizations working within our society to amplify really difficult conversations at times and explore solutions to the biggest issues of the day. And that's why we've teamed up with AARP on an event series to elevate the national dialogue around the issues that impact longer and healthier lives for all communities. Since early 2020, AARP has convened prominent thought leaders for a series of virtual events to discuss the health and wealth inequities that affect Americans across the lifespan and have an impact on our longevity. Today is no different. We are so excited to continue the conversations and host an important discussion focused on encouraging initiatives and innovative approaches to the private and nonprofit sectors that are tackling the inequities highlighted and exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We are honored to welcome a featured panel for today. It's going to be an incredibly dynamic discussion between Catherine Lawler, who is the Executive Director of the Atlanta Regional Collaborative for Health Improvement, David Clooney, who's the Executive Director of the Black Economic Alliance, and also Adele Langton, who's the Vice President of 10,000 Women at Goldman Sachs. It's going to be an incredible conversation, and we are just about to get started. First, a bit of housekeeping. We've sent all of our attendees a digital brochure with speaker bios and the agenda for today, and we're taking questions from the audience that our panelists will answer towards the end of the discussion, so don't miss that. Please submit your questions for our panelists throughout the Zoom Q&A function throughout the event. Now, I am so pleased to welcome our host, our friend, and our moderator for today's event, Senior Vice President of Global Thought Leadership at AARP, Dr. Jean Axius. Jean, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Olivia. We are so excited to be part of this conversation today. My name is Jean Axius, and I am extremely excited about what's going to be a very thought-provoking conversation. As Olivia indicated, we started down this journey over a year ago. Who knew that back in March of 2020 that so much would have changed? We saw the tremendous impact of this pandemic, both in terms of the health and the wealth implications, disproportionately impacting various different communities. In addition to the crises around the pandemic, we also saw racial reckoning for the first time in our nation's country with regards to many of the systemic issues that's been taking place. And we also thought that it would be an amazing opportunity to really think about what are those groundbreaking solutions, those big ideas across public, private, and nonprofit sectors that we could really leverage during this critical moment in time in our history to really solve and close these many, many gaps. I want to first of all start off by saying thank you. Thank you for being on this journey with us. As Olivia indicated, we've started this series since March of last year. And over the course of the series of major conversations with amazing leaders from different industries and sectors, you have been there right along with us, trying to process current events, trying to understand what could you do as an individual, or what could you do as a leader within your company, or what could you do as a leader within public sector to really solve these issues. And as we started is how we're actually going to close today, with a dynamic group of leaders across sectors to really spotlight game-changing ideas and solutions that can help accelerate the pace of change, because this is a moment in time that we really have to leverage to ensure that we're addressing a lot of the systemic issues that has taken place. Before we get started with our panel, I do want to give you a sneak peek announcement. In October, which is right around the corner, October 27th and 28th, we're going to be hosting a major global conference looking at health. Clearly, this pandemic has demonstrated to us that health is the foundation for all things, and that a healthy society means a healthy economy. So we're going to be exploring the global implications of health post a pandemic, during a pandemic, and what we've learned throughout this pandemic, and we hope that you'll join us. So you should be seeing a link on the chat function to register to this major global conference. In addition to thanking you for joining us on this journey and thanking you for being part of the process of trying to solve these major challenges, I also want to take a few minutes to acknowledge my amazing team. First, Stacey Alexander, who's the Vice President of Thought Leadership, and also Ian Hartman, who you are actually going to get a chance to hear from later today. Both Stacey and Ian and our amazing team in terms of Thought Leadership International have been working and been focused, really thinking about what are the opportunities to elevate these ideas in a way that accelerates that pace of change. So I also want to encourage you to visit us at AARP International/Build Equity. With that, I am extremely honored to help to facilitate today's amazing conversation. We kicked this off last year with Wes Moore, and we're going to close out this particular series with three amazing leaders. As Olivia indicated, we have Adele, we have David Clooney, and we have Catherine. And they're going to join us on this virtual stage for what's going to be a very dynamic conversation. And we want to encourage you to start sending in your questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and welcome our panelists to the virtual stage so we can actually kick off this amazing conversation today. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Adele. And hello, David. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, 2020 was, quite frankly, a very tough year. And in fact, many might say that 2021 is an extended remix of 2020. We saw disproportionate impacts in terms of disparities in health and wealth. And we saw significant implications in terms of the major racial reckoning that we've seen, particularly in the US context, that actually had some global implications. So before we get started in today's conversation, I want to just really ask you, number one, how are you doing? And number two, what are some of the lessons that you have learned or are learning through this pandemic? David, we're going to kick it off with you, and then we'll follow up with Catherine and Adele.
Well, thank you so much to AARP and Landmark for putting this together. And Jean, I hope that in 2020 and 2021, chivalry has not died. So I will go first this first time, but I hope that we let ladies go first in the future. So you're absolutely right. I think 2021 is not as different from 2020 as we had hoped. One thing that I've certainly learned in my personal and professional life, but particularly my professional life, is that we need to be bolder in our asks and think bigger. I think we've done a lot more measuring of the scope of some of the problems, particularly with respect to health and economic inequities in the last year and a half than we've done for many years before that. And I think we're just starting to understand the magnitude of the problem. And in order to fix it, we have to be very bold and think outside the box and really kind of adjust expectations, but also the resources that we're willing to put behind the work that we're doing to make systemic change. So one of the many lessons I learned during the pandemic, and I think we're still in it. So I think we're still learning a lot going forward.
Well, thank you so much, David. Catherine, and then Adele.
Thank you, Jean, and it's so great to be here with you, David and Adele and everybody. I think I can answer both questions. I would tell you that remarkably, I feel optimistic, and I do because we are seeing in our community this real renewed energy. It's like a new wave of focus and motivation and a deep acceptability that we will not only talk about, but we are building the architecture for systems change. And I have done work in the community for a very long time. And it's not that systems change wasn't spoken about and that people didn't know it was important, but it's much more authentic and has a depth that is very encouraging that we might be able to begin to re-engineer the way that we live together and the systems that are in play and that make it possible for each of us to thrive. So I feel very optimistic in that and look forward to more conversation this morning.
Thank you. Adele?
Jean, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And Catherine and David, such a pleasure to be with you today. I think in terms of what I've learned, Catherine was very optimistic. I don't want to go back to something sobering, but I think, as somebody working in women's economic empowerment, I think what we really learned, or what came sharply into focus, was the enormity of the challenge. I mean, we already knew before the pandemic that women are underpaid, underfunded, under-resourced, and I think in the last 18 months, the staggering expansion of the inequalities that exist for women globally and in the US has been really staggering, and something that we're hyper focused on here on our program. I think in terms of the positives, I think that what we've seen is that people are really open to talking and sharing about what they've experienced, and also that people are open to listening. I know at Goldman Sachs, we're really all about listening through this period, and I know that a lot of other organizations, nonprofits, community groups are really having a focus on listening as well. So that's kind of the lessons and some hope that I have from my perspective.
Well, I really appreciate this, and I want to kind of pick up on where you started, Adele, and that is really around some of the disproportionate impacts of this pandemic, particularly on women. And I want to really kind of set the stage for a conversation around intersectionality. We did some work at AARP that looked at the cost of age discrimination. And what we found was the fact that age discrimination in this country cost us about $850 billion in 2018. And then when you looked into the data, what you found was the fact that if you were an older adult and a woman, it was a double whammy. And of that 850 billion in age discrimination of lost productivity, more than a third of that was due to the fact that women were involuntarily forced out of the labor force. And we've seen through this pandemic, the disproportionate impact, particularly of women, either caregiving responsibilities, childcare responsibilities, and the whole 9 yards, being disproportionately impacted in many, many different ways. So as we start to kind of have these conversations around the solutions, I think it's also important to kind of raise the issue of intersectionality. So my first question to all of you, and I'll start with you, Adele, when we look at the health and economic disparities, oftentimes people want to look at these as siloed issues that we need to address. How can we make the case that addressing public health or economic challenge is an important step forward in actually tackling both of these issues?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I want to answer this question from the lens of the program that I focus on, 10,000 Women, which is a program to help women entrepreneurs with education and capital globally, but also from the perspective of a more recent program that Goldman Sachs launched in earlier this year, which is the 1 Million Black Women program. The impetus for that program is really all about the question that you asked and the framing there, the intersectionality between what women in America experience as women, and particularly as Black women. I said in my intro, women are underpaid, underfunded, under-resourced. If we look at any metric, Black women in America are inevitably behind on any metric. We know that there's a higher proportion of the childcare burden. We know that they ask for and receive less funding. I mean, we could spend the hour listing out the metrics that we could go into. And it has been called a pink collar recession, or the pandemic within the pandemic. And so I think you raise such an interesting point. It's about focusing on that intersectionality and the dual burdens that women face, particularly Black women in America. I think that at one of the metrics that I was looking at the height of the pandemic, women were dropping out of the workforce in the US at 8 times the rate of men. And, Catherine and David, and I think everyone tuning in can really, appreciate the massive ripple effects that has. Labor force participation, the gender pay gap, thinking about intergenerational impacts. We're talking about the impact on families and communities and children and the next generation. So I think incredibly important to focus on this area, to not sort of take the foot off the pedal, or we could really undo decades of progress.
Catherine, thank you so much, Adele.
I think what I just want to add to many of the points that Adele already raised, and something that we have been talking about very specifically in our community, is that the way that this pandemic has played out was 100% predictable, and that there is a level of ownership that we have to take in the fact that we probably could have drawn the map on where COVID was going to be hit the hardest, and that same map is the map of the folks we're struggling to keep safe and healthy and bring to solutions like vaccines. And so the predictability of the disparate impact requires a level of ownership if we're going to come out of this fundamentally different. And that is where part of our conversation and the work that we've been doing in Atlanta, but I know others are doing very similar work across the country, is how do you stop that predictable cycle? And part of it has to be being very present to people right now. When we interviewed individuals all across our community who are actively seeking supports to deal with the ripple effects that Adele was talking about, while they are certainly happy to talk about systemic issues, they need help today and they need assistance, and that assistance cannot be more difficult to get than assistance being provided to large corporations in this time. And so being very present to keeping people safe and well, but knowing that without dramatic and somewhat radical interventions, we can actually probably predict the disparate impact that any kind of recovery will also play out. And that's where that sort of radical owning the responsibility for a more radical interruption at all levels, but in the day-to-day where people live is part of our journey moving forward.
David?
I agree with both Adele and Catherine's points, and I would just add intersectionality is absolutely the right way to talk about this, and I appreciate that you put it in terms of the cost of inequities to the entire economy, and that's a lot of the perspective that the Black Economic Alliance brings about how Black communities have been disproportionately impacted by the both health and economic impacts of the pandemic. But we think about, to Catherine's point about these being predictable, before the pandemic, Black workers, for example, were already over-indexed in the low-skill, low-wage jobs that were going away to automation, and the pandemic has essentially accelerated that trend of more and more of those jobs going away and not coming back. So we need to be thinking from a policy and resources perspective about how we get ahead of these problems that we've already been working on, we already knew were a problem, and that that folks were so many more people of color who are, oversubscribed in lower income neighborhoods that have lower access to healthcare, either through, their employment or otherwise, also have, fewer resources and financial resources in terms of cushion and ability to be out of work, or even the option to work from home. Of course, that means the numbers are going to be significantly worse and exacerbated in, communities of color, low-income communities, and to Catherine's point, absolutely predictable. So I think the way we kind of have folks come together on these ideas of if you fix, one of these problems, you fix all of them, is looking at the data and looking at a lot of the information that we've known already, but essentially establishing the benefit to the entire economy and all of our ability to participate in a more productive and inclusive economy if we are to fix these problems on a long-term basis. And back to the point of thinking big, we know the scope of the problem is large, so we have to be bold in the solutions that we propose.
Thank you for that, David. And all of you talked about this idea that this was somewhat of a predictable scenario. And I guess one of the questions I would love to pose to the three of you is that oftentimes, what is our measure or our standard of success? And should we be thinking that moving forward, that standard should really be around preventing these obstacles to begin with, rather than trying to overcome these obstacles? And to your point, David, you mentioned thinking big. And Catherine, you mentioned really listening and being present. And Adele, you talked about all the different intersectionalities and some of the nuances that we need to take into account. Can each of you talk about what would be one big or solution or idea that would really kind of accelerate the pace of change, particularly given the work that you're leading for your organizations? And who would like to take that one first?
Let me let one of the ladies go first this time, please.
Well, I can start, and I know you two will build on this. So I'll just give one example, but we recently had the opportunity to partner with the National League of Cities and the Georgia Municipal Association to dive into the question, what does it mean for Atlantans to be well? And so we just got to talk to folks about what that meant. And what they said to us is so loud and clear, that the results are, indisputable, is that what it means to be well is to be able to make change in my own life and in my community. So there may be many other elements, whether I live in affordable housing, certainly having a good job. We had conversations about all of those things and good opportunity in life. But the linchpin was being able to make a change, being able to address an issue when it comes up, that personal efficacy, and also about being heard. And that really, I think, has opened a lot of really productive thinking in our community about what is about the solution that lies forward. So yes, these are big issues, and we have to own that they come from a very long history that got us to the place that we are. But knowing that that is what people center this question about, what would it be moving forward, I think is an important sort of starting place. The other issue I will just throw out there that we heard very loudly and clearly is stop framing us by deficits. And I know there's been work across the globe in thinking about an asset orientation towards change. But what they said very clearly is every time you put up a map of the highest diabetes rates, we're a health collaborative, every asthma, that is nothing to do with how we think about our community. And it has done some soul searching for us about every time we have used quantitative data to rank and say, these are the worst communities, they're the reddest on the map. It means that we aren't talking about that community. We're not even starting the conversation from the way they see it, which is always about the richness and the opportunity and optimism in the community. So I'll just start that. I know David and Adele, you'll have much more to add to it, but that's some new thinking that this pandemic has brought forward.
Adele?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on perhaps something a little more granular that we have picked up from a 10,000 Women perspective. You talked, Jean, about predictability and preparation. One of the things that became crystal clear through the pandemic is the technology gap that existed between a lot of male business owners and female business owners. And, I think when we think about the pandemic, something that gets a little bit lost is that some businesses and some individuals did really actually benefit from the boom that COVID created. There was certainly a bust, but in terms of the boom, the data that we've seen is that women really tended to not benefit from the boom and to be really impacted on the bust. It has a lot to do with the industries that women are located in, and technology is a big part of this. We talked about things being very unsurprising, unsurprising research that we did. Concern is surprising, but still not surprising, but still very concerning, is that the majority of women that we have in our community, we surveyed over 1,200 women from 37 countries. They were not prepared from a tech perspective for the pandemic. Businesses that were prepared, that were tech enabled, actually a lot of businesses increased revenue through the pandemic. The sad reality is that a very low proportion of those businesses were women. So many of the women that we work with still have brick and mortar stores and were just not tech enabled. So in terms of thinking about preparation, we know that this tech gap exists. We also know some sort of positive news from our survey is that 70% of the women said this is now their key priority. When it comes to hiring workers, tech and digital capability is among their top considerations that they're looking for. They are looking to digitize their businesses. The intention is there, and it's even higher in some specific regions. So in China, that number was 90% of women saying they want to focus on this. How do we help them? How do we close that tech gap? How do we get women to where they need to be so that, and as I say, it's a little more granular than what Catherine was talking about, but it's just one example where, it's not a surprise. So how do we be more prepared, and how do we help, and how do we take what we've learned from COVID so that we prevent these big gaps perpetuating?
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think in thinking about thinking big and being bold and doing things differently than we have before, being race specific in some of our solutions is a very important thing to do. And if you think about the scope of the problem, from BEA's perspective, we talk a lot about wealth building, and we've all heard I think the statistic that, or it's not a statistic, but that the single largest determinant of someone's trajectory to build wealth is the zip code that they are born into. And we saw a New York Times series, I think 2 or 3 years ago, that showed that race was the largest determinant of someone's ability to build wealth or trajectory to build wealth over their lifetime, even when controlling for geography, education level of their parents, of the financial wealth of their parents, so on and so forth. And if you just narrow down on one factor, housing has been the single largest builder of wealth and an avenue to the middle class for some Americans for generations. And looking at the role that the public and private sectors have played in essentially excluding Black people in particular, but people of color from the same opportunities. And one example is the National Housing Act coming out of the Great Depression. It was part of the New Deal and created the Federal Housing Administration, which in its underwriting guidelines essentially created redlining and said in these neighborhoods that are neighborhoods of color, Black neighborhoods, you cannot make affordable government-backed mortgages and home loans. And for over 30 years, 98% of those loans went to white families and created generational wealth that is still impacting the wealth gap today. And that is just one example of so many examples of how the wealth gap was created. And we have to be very specific and very targeted in kind of identifying how we got here in order to craft solutions that'll really be effective. And I know that's been a challenge, particularly for the government. But I'm happy to see companies like Goldman Sachs with their 1 million Black women and others being very specific about race. JP Morgan Chase, my old employer, with Advancing Black Pathways and others. And I think that is, and it's not just about Black folks, it's about women, it is about the Latinx community, Native Americans, a number of underserved, underrepresented communities. We have to be very specific about what we are targeting and what we're trying to counteract. And I know that that's been challenging to do, but I think that's a place we can really be bold going forward.
And appreciate the solutions and ideas that you're sharing with all of us. One of my favorite quotes is actually from Brian Stevenson, and he talks about that to be an effective problem solver, you have to get close. That it's very difficult to be effective and problem solve from a distance. And that proximity really, really matters. And I think that is one of the key things that I'm hearing from all of you, that proximity really, really matters. And what's the lens in which we're actually viewing this? And what's the mindset? And what are some of the solutions we saw throughout 2020 and in some cases going into 2021? Two stories. On one hand, it's the disproportionate impact of this pandemic on vulnerable communities. On the other hand, we also saw some promising solutions or excitement or enthusiasm from private industry and also from the public sector to really do something to solve that, to solve some of these challenges. My question to the three of you is, how do we sustain this momentum? And what are some of the opportunities, particularly for those who are joining us today, to be able to implement and help their organizations sustain some of the solutions in order to solve these issues? Adele, would you like to go first?
I think a really simple way to kick this off is to say it's about setting goals and publicizing them. Once the goals have been set, but they've been shared, that's how you keep accountability. Sharing them with organizations, at webinars like this, panels and webinars and Zoom meetings, and getting industry together to talk about our goals and to talk about the metrics that we've set, I think is a really important part of this. It's about accountability and it's about keeping the conversation going.
Catherine?
Yeah, I would add, Jean, that there's I think a couple of things that we've tried to think about, because this is long-term work. But so much to what Adele said, you need metrics for momentum, even if those are not the metrics that are ultimately signify the big change you're going for. So in the past, we have found that you need some short-term metrics to keep the energy and success without losing but we've done that in lieu of having these bigger long-term goals. And so somehow we have to be able to do both. So metrics for momentum, that we're making progress, keep the energy up, but make sure that we're keeping our eye on the longer term systems metrics as well, and that those are related. I would say maybe two other things that we have tried to work on is actual support for this way of working. So if we're saying this way of work requires intersectionality and cross-sector work, we can't ask everybody to do it just because it's the right thing to do. There has to be infrastructure and support. So when the going gets tough, there's people and resources to keep the new way of working moving forward. And the third and last thing I will just add is what we have been trying to be prepared for, but I think this is one of the hardest things, is if we're talking about systems change, you have to be prepared for when the system pushes back, because it always does. And so being surprised by that is just as bad as being surprised about how this pandemic played out. So we can know that, but we have to anticipate it and be ready. And it can go after people and it can go after organizations. And so we have to be able to stand together. But please add.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything. I think you're both exactly right. And to your point, Catherine, the measurement has to be both quantitative and qualitative. And I think public accountability and companies, the private sector and the government and nonprofit sector alike, holding themselves accountable so that, one, we could better understand the scope of the problem and not point at one or two companies and say, well, why didn't they hit their targets? But two, that we create a culture of kind of holding ourselves accountable. And that has not been enough the case. I think on a lot of fronts, companies have been, particularly in the private sector, embarrassed to release and disclose their internal numbers, whether it's about representation, whether it's about how much they've invested, whether it's about how much they've loaned to in communities of color for home loans, whatever the case is. But I think we've understood, I certainly better understand in this last year and a half, that this is not about one or two companies or even one or two industries. This is a society-wide problem that the more we put this information out there and better understand it, the better we'll be able to address it. And I think there has to be public accountability, because we've gotten very good at making announcements, not as good at following up on them a year and into them, 2 years in. And I've actually appreciated, one of the things that's been different is, a year in, particularly a year after George Floyd's murder, there have been a lot. Media has been covering more than in the past. Where are we a year in? Where are we toward the 10-year goal? And I think a lot more of that has to happen. And I would applaud companies like PayPal, and Dan Schulman has been a leader on essentially voluntarily disclosing, some of the data about what PayPal is trying to do from a racial equity perspective, and calling themselves out when they fall short, and trying to, course correct and figure that out. So I think all of that has to happen, but there has to be joint kind of engagement in the process of holding ourselves accountable.
Jean, if I could just add one more point. David, you were just talking about accountability in the conversation. One of the things that I think has been quite remarkable about the 1 Million Black Women process is the extent to which the process is about listening and actually taking on board comments, feedback, ideas for solutions from the community. And I think that's a big part of keeping up momentum. The 1 Million Black Women team have been conducting listening tours across the country. I think they're up to 41 at this stage. And, the team actually scours comments in the chat function. I believe two of the grantees actually came from identifying themselves in the chat function. So it's steps that are as granular as that. We're really encouraging the community, nonprofits, to be part of the conversation. And, I think us all sitting in a room in Manhattan, it doesn't necessarily generate the best and most diverse ideas. So really listening and having a function to be able to take on ideas, feedback, solutions, etc., I think is an important part of it as well.
Building off of this conversation, is this what we've been seeing for the last couple of months is around metrics, particularly around what we refer to as the ESGs, so environmental, social, and governance metrics. And it's fair to say that I think many of you would agree that the E is relatively well defined, and to some extent the G is as well. The S is a little bit more unclear, and it's evolving. So as we think about metrics, and as we think about public accountability, and as we think about really this momentum around the ESGs, what thoughts do you have, particularly for those who are executives on this call, to think about addressing the issues of disparities as part of that social aspect of this effort?
Yeah, I'll start, and I'll encourage folks to think about, so many companies have put a lot of resources into building out what they call their risk departments or functions, and they're essentially trying to look around the corner and figure out, what they're going to have to respond to and what they can get ahead of. And I think Catherine made the point earlier about trying to invest in some of these things earlier and being proactive instead of being reactive. And I would encourage corporate leaders to think in terms of risk. And social issues are becoming a larger and larger priority for prospective employees, current employees, other internal stakeholders, your shareholders, your leadership, the folks you do business with. And essentially companies are being, have to answer, sometimes responsibly, and I think at their best, when they're at their best, are doing it proactively about who they are as a company, what values are most important to them, and most importantly to this discussion today, how they're using their unique platform to address issues that are outside of just their driving kind of value to their bottom line. Of course, that is important for their ability to continue to do business and be profitable, but they also have to think about, and the Business Roundtable, put out a statement on this in 2019 about companies prioritizing not only their shareholders, but also their stakeholders, and thinking about all of that when they make decisions, and essentially baking that into their list of priorities. So I would say, think about that, and also think about how the country is changing and how much more diverse, younger, people of different backgrounds, immigrants are going to be your customers, your clients, and your employees. So it's in your best interest to get these issues right and to really be ahead of them, and to be thinking about them proactively instead of reactively.
Catherine or Adele?
Yeah, I think I would try to add a little bit, because I think you really talked about the issues there, David, is that from a health and public health perspective, what the framework that's often used is how do you activate in the downstream, the midstream, but while always going all the way upstream. And I think it's possible for all of the partners on this call to have strategies that address these issues in the E, the S, the G, that are downstream, midstream, and upstream. Those are ultimately the most effective and the most satisfying, whether it's to stakeholders or shareholders, to have that three-pronged approach. Downstream meaning exactly what is happening today, midstream a little bit, how did we get there, and upstream, what are the underlying root causes that continue to drive these trends over time. I mean, it's exactly what David said, is really following, if you will, the user experience, whoever that is, including the community in which the company is operating in. And we have heard through our work that it's critical that user experience be changed. And we have a strategy that we call inverting the burden, because so often the prejudice lies in the process. And it's not written on the outside of the building or the letterhead or the big statement about the initiative, but the process, because it's just not fully aligned with the group that is being targeted, the one trying to lift up or to change some of these long 100 years of trends on, that's why these things persist. So I would just, again, trying to build on what David is saying, that understanding really from that perspective is very downstream, and recognizing every time that the prejudice is actually steeped into the process itself.
I don't think there's a heap I can add to that. The only thing I'd say is not to get tied up in the semantics. When we talk about the S in ESG, the S needs to be as broad as it needs to be. I think if the last 18 months has showed us anything, we have to be nimble, we have to be flexible, and to David's point, we have to be bold. So not getting too tied up and deciding, predetermining, this is the E we focus on, this is the S we focus on, and this is the G as a company. It needs to stand for what we need to tackle as organizations.
And I appreciate it. And right before I actually transition to Ian, who's going to take some questions from our audience, I wanted to pose this last question to the three of you. I'm here in Washington right now, and change is a word that we hear quite often. And for those who are listening and participating on the call today, what words of wisdom or inspiration would you leave them with in terms of staying the course, particularly as it relates to changing this narrative, so that should there be another pandemic, we don't find ourselves having the same conversation?
Maybe I'll start because I came off a mute quickest. So you're absolutely right that, especially being in DC, thinking about our ability to make change, I think a lot about the point that Catherine just made on prejudice being in the process. A lot of this is unconscious. And, I think about unconscious bias and even algorithmic bias. So we didn't talk about technology as much, but the fact that that algorithmic bias is essentially playing out and reinforcing some of the same inequities, particularly based on race and otherwise, that human beings are, in some cases, well, I was going to say in some cases worse, means we need to look at the process, both manual and automatic, to figure out what is inherently broken in the process to fix it. And I would encourage people, as thinking about next steps, to tap into the energy that so many people in America had, particularly outside of the Black community, to be honest, in the 2 weeks after George Floyd's murder, where people were so moved by just the energy and momentum of what was happening in our country, that they felt personally responsible to figure out some kind of solution. And I would say to take that same kind of energy to figure out what in your daily life you can be doing. You don't have to go join, the Black Economic Alliance. You don't have to, quit your job and go do something different full time. But think about all of the places that you interact with inequality and with inequities, and what agency you have to be a voice for change, and to, when you see something, say something. So I think whether it's up your chain at work, whether it is, I know as a man, the Me Too movement is an example of this, when, there will only be men in a room, and there's an opportunity to say something or not say something, you speak up. So I think thinking about opportunities to, in your daily lives, all the different ways you interact with these issues, to be part of the solution and not the problem. That's what I would encourage people to do, is to be proactive, and to be bold in their questions, their asks, and the things that they're trying to change.
Catherine and Adele.
Oh, go ahead, Adele.
You can end, Catherine, with the wisest words. So I'll go before you. I think from our perspective, I think it's about not being too soon to call victory here. We've been talking a lot about, we're doing webinars and events, and we've, some of the language that we think about, and we just sort of scribble it out, is about, resilience and surviving the pandemic. And, the women that we're working with in Rwanda and Tanzania, South Africa, and in the US, we're not out of the pandemic. They're reminding us, we're not talking about resilience yet. We're still talking about survival. And I think as an extension of that, it's about not being afraid to dig into the extent of the challenges, do the research, keep doing the surveys, keep listening. And if it's uncovering super negative data and, the extent of the problem is being revealed, pay attention to that. Don't be too early to call time on the problem and focus on the solutions and, building back better and being there yet. I think it's just making sure that we're hyper focused on the reality. And then I think a little bit more positively, perhaps framing where we're at in terms of opportunity. The president of our foundation, she likes to say, talent is everywhere, opportunity is not. And I think framing it as this, there is an opportunity out there. So what can we do to harness that? I think that's a little more positive way to conceive of where we're at.
And I will just add, I think, building on both what David and Adele said, maybe two things. One, that you said, David, the narrative is right now. So we're not talking about changing the narrative tomorrow. We're talking about it right now. And I can give you a very real example. We've had these big conversations in our community. We're right in the South with all of the history and difficulties. We're the city that's too busy to hate, which is the way that we hide behind some of our issues. And we've had all this great conversation, and yet we are talking about what we've experienced, like many metro areas have, which is an uptick in crime. All the language that we are using around that crime is doing everything to reinforce old stereotypes, particularly racial stereotypes. So we just had a session last week training all of our partners on how to change the narrative in crime, because that narrative is right now. This isn't about tomorrow. And then I would say that I think we get the most inspiration in our collaborative from just recognizing that there is nothing we're experiencing that we didn't create ourselves, and therefore we have everything we need to make the change. These are our rules, and we can change them whenever we decide to do it. And I just want to again say how exciting it has been to be a part of the conversation, and look forward to all the other insights that I know our participants have as well.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Ian.
Welcome, everybody, and thanks, Jean. And so we'll get right to the question. So following up on what Catherine just talked about, we had an audience member who is asking about, specifically, are there one or two community models that you would recommend that have been highly effective in in creating equity and also accountability, whether it be in the economics field or in the healthcare space?
Well, I mean, I can offer, and I think others, I think there's even examples both in David and Adele's work right now that they've shared with us. But, I think we're seeing that going back to the way what Atlantans told us about what they need to be well, this idea of personal efficacy, the ability to solve problems in your own life and to address issues in your own community. We are seeing more ideas and experimentation around the idea of guaranteed income. Empowering people with the resources and letting them approach the challenges in their lives, the ability to get where they and their families aspire to go, with the ultimate control and efficacy over where that hopes to be. And we find that a very promising practice of equity and really centering what we heard from folks, which is they know what they need. They need the rules to get out of the way, and so they can achieve that.
And I'll just add, I don't know if anybody has it all figured out, so I don't have a specific example to point to, but I do think one of the encouraging things I've seen, particularly in the last year and a half, but in more recent years, is the appreciation for the need for effective public-private partnerships and really all three sectors, public, private, and nonprofit, coming to the table with a recognition that the scope of the problem is so large that they all need to be rowing in the same direction, kind of crowdsourcing resources and working together in the spaces of access to capital, particularly for small businesses. I think that's been the scope of the problem was perhaps too large for any one entity to fix it during the pandemic and as we're trying to come out of it now. But I have seen a lot of very bold solutions proposed in the public and private sectors that I think have been, and the collaboration among the sectors has been very promising in that sense. So I think that's a lesson we can take forward and figure out how to do more of that, where you don't have folks working in silos, but they're essentially coming together, sharing information, figuring out how they can work efficiently and most effectively together.
And just an extension of what David was saying about those partnerships, we don't view 1 Million Black Women as a Goldman Sachs program. We actually view it as a partnership with Black women-led organizations, nonprofits, and community partners. So having that mindset and being fully prepared to know where our limitations are and where partners can step in, I think is a really important part of that.
So I want to build on, take a question from the audience that builds on this question of data equity. And so this person is asking, so we know the demographics are shifting, but do we have all of the information that we need? So for example, non-white represents a large and diverse group of people. What do we know about the intersection of race and gender with specific ethnicities? For example, the audience member asked about Hispanic women. So kind of this question around data equity and how we collect that information.
I'll offer, I think we're just starting to better understand the need to collect better data and disaggregate the data so that you understand it better at a higher level of granularity. And that's something that, the Black Economic Alliance through our foundation is one of the things we're hoping to achieve, because in even trying to measure the problem, we've realized there's so little data, reliable, comprehensive data, that is particularly financial data that is race specific, that we've had to kind of cobble together bits and pieces of information from different places, and we know we don't have a full view of the problem. But another piece of this is who is collecting the data. And as we talk about representation, it's so important to have different perspectives represented, even when you're looking at economic data. And we at BEA have talked a lot about the dearth of Black economists throughout the Federal Reserve System, for example, and elsewhere, even in academia in some places. So I think as we think big again, we have to think about all the different opportunities we have to improve the information we're working with, collecting, and how we're analyzing it.
I would just add that I think it is about all of the things that David just said, and just to call out that what is often missing is data about the system itself. So it is very important that we understand people, but we really, some of this idea of data equity is understanding how the system works and the inequitable impact of the system. So we need to better understand, where healthy food is going, where investments in our community are going, where are quality jobs that you could support your family on. So it is very important that we understand the shifting demographics, and David explained that very well. But I would say too often we focus only on people, and we also have to collect data on the way the system interacts. Otherwise, we'll keep holding people accountable for the change, not necessarily the system accountable for the change. And we need, it's certainly, it's a big picture, but I think there's a dearth of information on what that is. And that might be a way that we can really start a different way coming out of this.
So I'll keep going with the next question. And this one comes up a lot at all of our throughout this series is, you know, we often talk about lessons learned, not only on this series, but a lot of the conversations we're having at work and even at home. And so how do we make sure that as we move forward, we're learning from these experiences, and 2 or 3 years down the road, as the person points out, we've kind of not had a collective amnesia and forgotten some of the things that we've learned through this experience and kind of repeat the issues that started us off a couple of years ago.
I mean, I think it's what we've been talking about, the metrics, sharing the metrics, being accountable for those metrics, and really conversations like this, and making sure that, you know, to David's point about being bold, okay, we're having this conversation. How do we make sure our bosses are having this conversation? How do we make sure the thought leaders are having this conversation? I think we've touched on it through the session, but to me, that's where the solution lies, or that's our best hope.
Yeah, and I think keeping the conversations top of mind, and to the earlier point about, you know, we're good about announcements, we're good about kind of rolling out work streams and working groups, but then not checking in 6 months down the road, a year down the road, 2 years down the road about, you know, what have been the outputs, what have we learned, and how we implemented those into, you know, the culture of the different organizations that we're trying to change.
And I would just bring back up, I think, something that Adele and David said really well earlier, which is, you know, how can we keep that momentum? It has to be recognizing how everybody benefits when we make these kind of changes. And both of them shared that in their own work, and I think provided really great examples of that. So that as we continue, the fact that this is long and hard, it shouldn't be surprising, and preparing for that by recognizing that it really is about the change in the economy for everyone, what it means to thrive, and that benefit is worth pursuing even when it gets hard again, or, you know, this idea of amnesia, which will be very frustrating, but maybe that's predictable too, and shame on us if we're not prepared for that.
All right, so Jean, I think I'll put one more question out here, and then we can kind of wrap up. So a couple of people asked, and I'll try to mash it together as best I can here on the fly, of thinking about education and the importance of education in this conversation, and having equal access to education. And some of the inequities can actually start much earlier downstream than, you know, by the time you get into older age. So just any thoughts that you have kind of to end out the conversation about how we kind of embed education in this conversation as we create these solutions for an equitable future?
I can start on this one. One of the women that we work with through our programs, I think she summed it up perfectly. I'll never forget. She said, when you have education, you have choice. And I think, you know, Catherine, David, everyone would agree that that is such a profound statement. We're talking about the choice for that woman. We're talking about, you know, intergenerational impacts, the choices for her children, the impacts that has on her entire life, the community that she operates in, etc. And I think answering this from the lens of corporate, you know, it's not surprising that, so we at Goldman Sachs, through our philanthropic program, have a focus on education. We're not the only ones by any stretch. I think there was a report in 2018, the top 300 Fortune companies highlighted education as the main focus area for their philanthropic work and their charity work, and that's for a reason. You know, the same woman who talked about choice, she said a lot of women that she knows experience this midlife reality that they're not on the path that they wanted to be because of a decision that was almost made for them 10, 20, 30 years ago, when they didn't have the financial opportunity to do the courses and to do the education that would have served them best for the rest of their life. So it's about, as we think about corporates, and we do have this philanthropic focus, how are we making sure those interventions are right across the board? How do we help that woman 20 or 30 years ago But how do we also help her now? How, when she's in mid-career, how are we setting up these, access to education? And I think the explosion in online learning and free resources is absolutely fantastic, but it triggers us as we're rolling these programs out. How are we getting them right? How are we thinking about the woman who's mid-career, working on her business, supporting her family, supporting her community? How are we making those online courses, interesting for her? How does she have the motivation to actually get that certificate while she's doing this course at midnight, in between all the other things she's doing? How do we create a sense of community and a classroom type experience when she's doing this online learning on her own? So I think, number one, making it accessible for sure. Number two, being very thoughtful about all the places at which we need to have these interventions. And then number three, being really realistic about how people are learning and making sure that it actually works in practice.
And not too much to add there. I think that was a great response. And I'll just, to the point of intersectionality earlier, so much about any family or individual's options around education is driven by their socioeconomic status, and to the point of, if we fix some of these problems, we address and fix others, and that's such a huge core part of the problem, is kind of creating a better financial trajectory for communities of color and underserved communities, so that they will have increased optionality and choice in education, and then obviously and all the downstream impacts of their educational choices down the road.
Well said, both of you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Adele, Catherine, David, and also my good friend, Ian. This has been a tremendous, powerful conversation with great insights and really thought-provoking things that we can do as we continue to go down the path of closing these systemic gaps, both in terms of health and as well as wealth. As we close out our conversation today, I want to share some words with you that I hope you will take away with from our conversation today. And these words actually mean a lot to me. In the book, Across That Bridge, A Vision of Change and the Future of America, the late Congressman John Lewis wrote, "It is only through examining history that you become aware of where you stand within the continuum of change." Let me read it again. And my team knows this because we actually had this book as a book club earlier this year. It is only through examining history that you become aware of where you stand within the continuum of change. It is only examining history. So someday this pandemic will be history. We are not through with it yet. But I want to ask you this question. Will it be a barely noticeable blip 100 years from now? Will it be a defining mark where things got even worse? Or will this be the opportunity where we actually took the bold, courageous actions, many of which you heard today, in order to really address change? The phrase, the continuum of change, really resonates with me because it's where we've been, it's where we are right now in this moment, and it's where we're actually headed. And everything changes all the time, always, macro, micro, or somewhere in between. So where do I, and frankly, the purpose of these conversations have been, where do you, or frankly, where do we stand along this continuum of change? And maybe the most important two words of Mr. Lewis's quote that resonates so much with me is become aware. The word become means begin to be, and aware means having knowledge or perception of a situation or fact. So becoming aware is what happens when we get close. Becoming aware is what happens when we approach the situations with a asset mindset rather than a deficit mindset. Becoming aware is actually when we look at these issues through an intersectionality. I want to wish all of you my tremendous gratitude for taking the time to walk with us today. And I hope that you've learned through these series and also through this conversation that we have an opportunity to be brave, to be courageous, to be purposeful, to become aware. I challenge each of you to think about what we heard today and get close to listen and learn, to make decisions, and more importantly, to act. And to all do this with a sense of courage and a sense of urgency, because now is the moment. And finally, in the words of the late John Lewis, I challenge you to become aware. No matter where we are in our lives, we are never too old and frankly, never too tired to begin to be. Let's not let others write our history books. Let's write them and solve these problems with tremendous courage and action. And let's write a new story, and let's make the script of America 2.0 so much better than the original. So with that, thank you for joining us. I want to encourage you to visit us soon.